Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We have an exciting session for you all today. It's creating powerful member experiences, Cigna's journey on AWS HealthLake. My name is Mirza Beg. I'm a principal solutions architect in the Health AI team. I'll get into what the Health AI does in a minute. But before I get started, if I can just sort of review the agenda and I'll then pass it over to Mani. Mani Paul Raj is my co-presenter here from Cigna. He's the accountable leader of the interoperability platform in the overall Cigna group. So in the agenda today, what we're going to cover is just look at what the business objectives are from a Cigna perspective, the way the business model is set up, what the overall outcomes are, et cetera, plus the various challenges that a company like a Cigna has to sort of overcome. And then that will be covered by Mani. And then I will get into the technology piece of it, which is on the AWS HealthLake. What is that? How does that work? What's under the hood a little bit? And what does a solution actually look like? And then look at next steps. So with that, what I'd like to do is actually pass the ball over to Mani.
Thank you, Mirza. Hey, everyone. I'm really excited to join you all here today. And first of all, thank you very much for joining us. And I'm Mani Paul Raj. I'm part of the Evernorth Health Services group. Some of you might be wondering, what is Evernorth Health Services and what does it do? I'd like to take this opportunity to give you all a brief overview of the Cigna group and where does Evernorth Health Services fit in there. Cigna group has two divisions, Cigna Healthcare and Evernorth Health Services. Cigna Healthcare, as many of you are aware, is a global healthcare company that provides health benefits and other services to more than 170 million members across 30 countries. And Evernorth Health Services, on the other hand, provides solutions ranging from pharmacy and care solutions, medication management solutions, behavioral services solutions, to various customers, including Cigna Healthcare. Remember, Cigna Healthcare is one of the customers, not the only one, and we do serve other Cigna Healthcare and Cigna Group subsidiaries as well. Our mission is to improve the health and vitality of the members we serve, and we are continuously looking for options and opportunities to do that exactly. And as you can imagine, most of these opportunities are primarily data-driven. Now, Evernorth Interoperability is a team I am from, and we are looking at building an interoperability platform which underpins the enterprise-wide applications for data exchange between our partners, various other customers. We are building this for other customers as well. And what are these data-driven opportunities I talk about? For example, one of them is the regulatory requirements. We do have regulatory requirements from federal governments, state governments. For example, we recently enabled member direct access for our patients' health information in an interoperable and a standardized way. Some of our healthcare folks understand that I'm talking about patient access API here. And when it comes to healthcare business, the regulatory requirements are both complex and very demanding, and they are continuously evolving as well. These requirements have specific nuances and are often not so flexible in terms of timelines. We are also looking at improving our member experiences using the clinical and claims data exchange platform, where, for example, improving the prior authorization workflows, which means a lot for any healthcare organization for that matter. And overall improved care delivery measures as well. And then this platform, like I said, is a key component of this overall solution, and we want to continuously optimize and improve the platform as well. And healthcare is a complex business, and especially for a business like ours, where data is coming from various sources and different standards, and bringing that into one big platform it has a lot of challenge, and also the amount of data we are talking about is in terabytes. So our mission is to build a secure, available, operationally efficient, and performant platform. And Mirza, you might have heard requirements like these from many customers. Right?
That's a common ask across many customers. I'm sure some in the audience are empathizing as well.
Yeah, and the only unique thing I would say in this is the interoperable nature of it, the FHIR data, FHIR format that we often look at. Now, while envisioning this platform or getting started with this, we also run into challenges, experienced these, and we were able to project these challenges as well. Cost comes first. The overall cost of ownership is the third-party licensing, the infrastructure cost, the build cost that continuously we are building and deploying, because all these components have to come together to bring these data into a platform. That has been a key challenge for us. And the scalability is another aspect when we are talking about external customers' data, and there's a lot of data that are coming into this platform. Scalability is key as well, and the performance goes hand in hand with that. And like I talked about the regulatory requirements, SLAs are really strict, and we have massive data set, and that has to go aligned to the SLAs that the regulatory organizations define for us. And data reusability has been another challenge, in the sense that we don't want to build multiple for-purpose data zones or data layers. We want to bring these data into our platform once and then use it for multiple purposes. We don't want to just do one for analytics, one for the patient access API kind of setup. So that's another potential opportunity and challenge we saw in the platform. Now, when HealthLake was introduced to us, we started small. Just like anything we do, we started small with HealthLake, and we identified some must-have features that we are looking at, and we were pleasantly surprised to see the kind of results and the logs, the pressure test results that came through to us, and the speed of ingestion, the projected cost, and the API responses as well. We were really surprised to see the kind of value that HealthLake brought to us. And we started with a pilot. One workflow is already in production with HealthLake, and that is after our successful test of quality and security tests. And we worked hand in hand with AWS to bring HealthLake to what we have now. And to further talk about AWS HealthLake, I'll pass it to Mirza.
Thanks, Mani. So you all must be wondering what HealthLake is, right? If you look at HealthLake essentially is a managed service that is a HIPAA eligible service. So let me sort of break those two components down, right? And then I'll come to the specific capabilities that are listed on this particular slide. When I say managed service, it's unlike a regular service, like for instance at S3, where you're basically consuming that service as is, right? It's a storage service and you're consuming it directly. When you talk about AWS managed services, what you're essentially talking about is several different services, tier 1 services, S3, Dynamo, Glue, OpenSearch, Kinesis, et cetera, all of those services engineered together to present this cogent concept like a HealthLake. There are several other managed services within the AWS family, but within for HealthLake, and then presenting basically two specific key capabilities associated with that. And then the HIPAA eligibility part is also very important, is because the underlying services are not only HIPAA eligible, but also the managed service part of it, right? So It goes through a strenuous level of testing to make sure that the PHI that you will be ingesting or bringing in is exactly it's conforming to the rules and norms that are mandated by from the HIPAA framework, right? So at a macro level, you're essentially looking at two capabilities. One is a RESTful FHIR API endpoint, which is on the right-hand side, and the other one is on the analytics side. So generally speaking, when you look at a modern FHIR server, you look at FHIR being brought in and not necessarily on the and not being used necessarily from an analytical perspective. Here, what we're doing here is essentially allowing you to bring in data at a massive scale, similar to Cigna's, and making that available to be transacted on real time, right? So when I say transactional APIs, I mean the fact that you can actually build a API layer on top of it, a UI layer on top of it, and have that transact in a real time manner, right? Below 100 milliseconds, for instance, for your reads and your cut operations, right? Create, update, delete operations. And depending on the search and the complexity associated with the search, it could be 100 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds, and so on, right? And the amount of data as well. So that's, and when you're building an application, when you're building a member-facing application, whether that member happens to be a patient member, right, an insurance member, or let's say if you're on the provider side, let's say a clinician that is consuming the information that you're exposing, all of that needs to be very synchronous and very optimal. So you can absolutely build a very powerful performant application layer with HealthLake in the background, right? And the underlying data model here is FHIR. FHIR inherently, as most of you know, is nested JSON objects, essentially ranging from a kilobyte to possibly megs and gigs. But generally, the average size of a FHIR JSON object is around 1 to 2 or 3 kilobytes, right? Not that big. EOBs generally are much more higher, explanation of benefits, especially in Cigna's case, or any payer's case for that matter. But generally speaking, the patient or the observation or the encounter or the condition records are essentially smaller records, right? So what you're dealing with is very small files that need to be transacted upon extremely fast and presented back to your member, right? Via your whatever UI layer, whether mobile app or web app, et cetera. And you're not just doing that to create a clinical app per se, but also your interoperability posture as well. So you may have a member app or a provider app for that matter, that is exposing information that conforms to the patient access API, right? Which a provider inherently uses in terms of looking at all the various clinical or financial records associated with that patient. Either way, that API consumption, that back and forth, is through that FHIR API transaction. So we have folks like Cigna. We also have large ISVs, top 5 in the global health arena, like a GE, for instance, that are actually building point-of-care applications on top of HealthLake. In fact, GE is using HealthLake as a data fabric to essentially build their clinical applications on top of it. The first one that they rolled out, which recently was in the news, is the Care Intellect related with oncology. So you can imagine HealthLake powering a point-of-care application at the time when the patient and the clinician encounter is happening, right? So very performant, very responsive. And all of that is being done using Smart on FHIR, right? Meaning it's PHI, right? So with PHI, you absolutely not just want to have authentication, but the right amount of authorization as well, especially as the regulations around authorization are getting more granular and granular, right? For instance, with the recent regulations, right, consent becomes an important issue. How do you manage the consent part of it as you're determining whether an access to an individual's record is allowed or denied, right? So those are all part of the Smart on FHIR spec, right? 1.0 was out there a couple of years ago. 2.0 is out now. 2.2 is going to be essentially in production by the time 25, 26 comes around. So you have deeper level of authorization, fine-grained access, fine-grained authorization access levers that are being sort of essentially deployed. And the beauty here is that you don't have to understand that all in terms of what the nuances is. HealthLake supports that, right? So all you're doing is basically adapting to the framework that Smart on Fire has, making sure the right roles get the right permissions with the right consent associated with that, and then you can be confident that you're addressing the security part of it, as well as making sure that it's performant, right? Because you can have a performant and an open sort of an access, which obviously is not going to work in the real world. So that's on the left-hand side of the slide. On the right-hand side, that same data that you're bringing in, the Fire JSON data that you're bringing in, essentially is being transformed by the managed service, by HealthLake, into an analytics iceberg table. Basically, that's being transformed into a tabular format. And when I say tabular format, the overall schema is not changing, right? Meaning it's still conformant with the Fire JSON schema. So like for instance, if you wanted to look for whether Mirza has diabetes, right, in his lab report, you would still go to that database, that data store, .observation, for instance, right? Because that lab report is going to be most probably in the observation resource type within Fire, and as such, you would sort of use the same sort of pattern when you're accessing it directly from an analytical perspective, right? So that ETL process, that transformation process, is happening behind the scene, unbeknownst to you in a sense. You can obviously turn that off or turn that on, right? You have options there, but it is happening without any input from you, and that way, again, it's part of the managed service. So, and then once the data is in there, you have all capabilities or all the various sort of levers that you can have with SQL on Fire, with SQL on Fire. Granted, the object that you're mining is essentially nested, but with dot notation and SQL, you can pretty much mine that data as you see fit. Whether you want to sort of glean that nugget out of for like say social determinants of health data or anything specific around cohort management and so on, right? All of that information is going to be available for either dashboarding and a variety of other purposes. And then with the analytics capability, with HealthLake overall, we also have Comprehend Medical. Comprehend Medical, I'm sure you've heard in the last 3-4 days that you've been here, is our natural language processing, right? So for instance, if you have a progress note that is in a PDF, let's say, you basically bring that into HealthLake in the document reference resource type. And if you have Comprehend Medical, if you have NLP turned on your data store, that document is going to be essentially parsed through for natural language, and then that unstructured data is going to be now structured. Structured in the sense that observations, medication statements, conditions, right, are going to be essentially gleaned out of that particular record, and system-generated resources will be created for you to be able to say, if Mirza has diabetes, for instance, is he on metformin, right? And as such, do whatever you need to do with that information, right? So you can then take that information, transact on that using APIs, Fire APIs, but also analyze that for your analytical workflows, right? So those are all possible with the analytical, with the Comprehend Medical integration. So to basically to picturize what I just spoke about, if you're looking at the left-hand side of the house, as we all know, majority of the healthcare data is not in Fire, not yet anyway. And that journey to Fire is going to take possibly years to get there, meaning to Fire to become a dominant data model is going to take years. But there is a growing, the industry is moving towards Fire as a data model, right? Not just the exchange part of it, but also the storage part of it. So you have majority of the data that is unstructured in many cases, but also not in Fire. So there is a conversion process that generally folks have to go through. There are companies out there, some of them are customers of ours, that have adopted a Fire first strategy, mostly from a clinical applications build perspective, but from a payer perspective, FHIR is nascent and inherent to the overall ecosystem that any payer has, right? At least there is one silo or one group that understands FHIR within all of the payers that I have encountered, right? But in other places, they have adopted it fully and they've gone FHIR first. Point I'm trying to make is that there is a conversion path, whether you do it yourself or whether you used some of the 12 different HealthLake connectors with our partners like InterSystems, Redox, Availity, et cetera, et cetera. We have those connectors built in. You can use those as well to bring the data into HealthLake. And that middle box is where the managed services, right? I want to spend a little bit of time on the IG piece and the implementation guides piece. Mani was referencing on that step ladder slide that Mani was presenting. There was a specific middle step where it talked about IGs. So implementation guides, obviously from a compliance perspective, are very material. But even if you're not interested in compliance, you do care about data quality, generally speaking. You care about whether it's is garbage that is being basically brought in. True that that payload may be a valid FHIR JSON object, but does it actually have validity from if it has a LOINC code or if it has an ICD-10 code or a SNOMED code, are those valid codes, right? So there's a data quality piece of it. And like, for instance, US Core also demands that certain elements have to be part of an object, right? Whether it's a patient object or a observation object and so on. Like, for instance, US Core on the patient side requires that you have race and gender as part of the patient record. FHIR does not, right? FHIR generically does not, but there are elements in there that you have to. So from a data quality perspective, you can have specific IGs that you may have from a data quality perspective that are essentially employed within your enterprise, and you can do that at the time of ingestion on HealthLake. We have a list of IGs that we support out of the box. There are a couple hundred IGs out there. Majority of them are based on US Core, and we can support any one of those if you want it, right? So Smart on FHIR, the IGs I have listed, Care and Blue Button, which is on the patient access side, Da Vinci, which is many of the payers use, right? The Smart on FHIR, I talked about in terms of that overall scope. Right now it's on 1.1, 2.0 is going to be released in December, actually this month. 2.2 is coming by the middle of next year on the Smart on FHIR piece. And then you have the integrated FHIR, Comprehend Medical, and the analytics piece that I addressed as well. On the right-hand side is your consumption layer, right? What is your use case to essentially now use that data? Do you have any prediction model that you want to run, right? Are you, like, for instance, concerned about risk of readmission, for instance, or the risk of heart disease for a given cohort or for a population set? So you can do all of that. You can represent that in a dashboard. You can actually plug it into your essentially your proprietary apps, the way Cigna has done. So all of those are consumption patterns on the right-hand side. This is a eye chart, I know. So I'm not going to read every single line here. I'll try not to. But I will walk through some of the key sort of steps associated with what I'm representing here. So if on the left-hand side, various formats, X12, HL7, or HIE data, which is CCDA generally, provider data from an EMR, IoT data from devices that may be operating in let's say, an emergency room or an ICU bed, right? All of that data needs to come in. And it's coming in from multiple sources. Perhaps you have a patient that not only just goes to one physician, but several different physicians, and you want to sort of collate that data. All of that data can essentially come into HealthLake. If it's in FHIR, great, you can bring it in synchronously, you can bring it in via batch, asynchronously, but that's basically 1A and 1B on this particular slide. If it's not in FHIR, there's a conversion pathway that you have to go through, which is essentially step 2, right, the box at the bottom left, and you would have to go through either a DIY rather, or one of the partner HealthLake connectors that are available. We do have We do have plans in 2025 to have a native data converter built into HealthLake, so that way you are not essentially trying to figure out what that conversion path looks like. So it's going to be integrated into HealthLake to make that more easier from an onboarding perspective. But once it's in there, it goes to the ingest, and then go to basically the box on the top right, which is the transact layer, which is where essentially Cigna is at, which is you have that data, you're now exposing it, whether it's for member experiences or whether it's for patient access API or payer-to-payer data exchange or a variety of other API associated transactions, right? And at the bottom right, you have the analytics. Both Athena and Amazon Athena and Amazon Redshift are part of the ecosystem that you can use as a compute layer to essentially tap into the iceberg table. Meaning you can log into your Athena, you can use Athena, for instance, to essentially query that data and bring out that specific nugget of data that you're looking for. So, and if you wanted to do it at scale, of course, Redshift is a workhorse, and as such, you can do that as well. So some of the outcomes that I wanted to, so Mani had presented a slide in terms of the challenges that were there. I want to just sort of look at some of the outcomes here from a HealthLake perspective. So TCO sometimes is just sort of bandied about, right? But I just want to spend maybe a couple of minutes on this because it's not just the TCO and the fact that you're getting a service that you generally would have to either maintain or build or sustain like over a longer period, right? It's the fact that the performance of that service is all incumbent upon AWS. Meaning, for instance, if the API latency is above a certain threshold, you or your team members are not getting paged, it's our team that is getting paged, right? That's the beauty of the managed service, right? So operationally from a burden perspective, right, not only are you spending less time to build what you need to build, that undifferentiated heavy lifting, which I'm sure you've heard several times this week, right? Not only are you spending less time doing that, but you're also spending less time operationally to sustain that effort, right? So that way you're then leveraging or reusing those resources for something higher up, right? To create more business value for your respective companies, right? So lower TCO, just from a pure apples to apples comparison, absolutely, right? Customers have received somewhere between 40 or 50%, right, in terms of TCO. It depends on the customer, but also on the overall sort of mechanism associated with the dev and the maintenance part of it as well. Scale and performance, this is one of our key differentiators. We're not differentiating here on the data model. Fire is fire, right? Multiple vendors support Fire, fine. We conform to the Fire spec. It is not AWS's spec. It's an open source, in a sense, spec because it's community driven. And the whole world is contributing to it, is leveraging it as they see fit. And it's amenable to, it's extensible as well. So we're not doing anything different. There's no differentiation there, but we're following this spec. What we're also doing from an API perspective, generally speaking, you could also do that. But doing that at a performance and a scale, meaning if you have 10 gigs of data on your data store, or 10 terabytes of data, or 100 terabytes of data, or possibly even a petabyte of data, which would be essentially all the data for, I think, much of the world, right? Given the fact that there are very small sort of resource objects, the performance that you expect is roughly the same. Meaning, if I'm doing a read operation, I'm getting 40 milliseconds on that read operation on a 10 gig data store. I would expect that same 40 milliseconds at a 100 terabyte data store, right? And we have third-party tests that, if we get into our conversation, we can sort of show you what that looks like. You can test it out yourself as well, right? So not just for reads, but also for searches, for all the cut operations, right? That's material. You're not gonna scale from a performance perspective without sacrificing something, generally speaking. But we have taken care of that to make sure that you can scale without having to worry about it. And again, it's part of the managed service as well. The SLA conformance is mostly from an ingestion perspective. Generally payers, right, get this boatload of explanation of benefits, generally not dumped, what's the right word?
Generated.
Generated, thank you. Every so often, right? And that has to be essentially ingested within a short period of time, whether that time period is 24 hours based on whatever arrangement you have, or 48 hours or 72, but within a certain period of time. And that is, if you don't meet that SLA, you have to inform your stakeholders that, yes, I got this, this huge data, right, given to me, but I have not been able to sort of ingest it appropriately. So that ingestion speed needs to be at scale, and we have taken care of that as well. And I think, Mani, you have some experience with that as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to go into the details, but yeah, we do have, I highlighted that as part of the challenges. Again.
That's right. So, and then the data reusability part, right? The fact that you're bringing it once, you're reusing it multiple times. So, a couple of things I want to highlight here. Some of it is already covered, right? The undifferentiated heavy lifting I mentioned, the zero ETL, both from a clinical and an application workflow perspective. The cell-based architecture is interesting, right? So when you first sort of take HealthLake for a spin, we have a default sort of configuration that we basically deploy. That default configuration may or may not necessarily work for you. That default configuration basically says that you will bring in X number of gigabytes and are able to transact on it and meet and still be below the threshold in terms of SLA latency or ingestion speeds or transaction capability, et cetera. But let's assume for a minute that you have a large amount of EOBs, since we're talking about EOBs, right? But you don't have that many, let's say, allergy intolerance records, right? So you may have billions of EOBs, but let's say millions of allergy intolerance. You're not going to take a peanut butter approach and basically say, all of my indices are going to be given the same amount of power, right? From a workhorse perspective. So if you have a use case like that, we have the ability to actually do tweaking on our side of the house to make sure your specific use case, whether it's on the search side, whether it's on the ingestion side, whether it's analytical side, right? We have flexibility there to only tweak that little component of it without affecting the overall price, right? You're not paying extra for that extra tweak, right? You're just basically paying on a consumption-based model, which is pay as you go. Integrated NLP I covered. Multimodal analysis I want to just again spend a couple of minutes on. So initially I'd said that I'm part of this particular group called Health AI. Health AI is building purposeful services for healthcare and life sciences. You all, I'm assuming, are mostly interested in the healthcare side of the business, not necessarily in the life sciences part of it. But on the life sciences part of it, we have one specific service called Health Omics. On the expo floor in the Venetian, we have several booths there. If you have some time, please swing by and check them out. Health Omics does genomics, sequence, and variance data. It's a data store as well, because what we want to do is make sure that data storage, the data layer is optimal, and for you to be able to run your workflows and AI and ML models on top of it. Similarly, we have a health imaging service as well, which is our DICOM-based and digital pathology-based store. Again, same thing, you bring it in and you can massively scale and run your workflows on top of it. HealthLake is another one which I was just talking about. There are two more others, right? Comprehend Medical is the other one. And the last one is HealthScribe, which is your ambient listening. I'm on the team that does HealthScribe, Comprehend Medical, and HealthLake, right? So you can see from a patient to provider encounter, from an ambient listening perspective, that conversation being essentially projected in a SOAP note, converted into a summary, which then gets parsed from natural language perspective and then stored in a storage layer for you to then analyze it and take it to scale. Whether it's via an LLM or via SageMaker from an AI ML workflow, up to you, right? Depending on your use case. But you can see what we're doing here in terms of that overall flow of how information is going to flow from the patient to provider access, and then all the way down to care management care authorization, and so on, right? So those are a couple of things on a multimodal analysis. We have a blog out there on Amazon.com which speaks to multimodal analysis as well if you're interested, further interested in that. A couple of additional pieces that I want to go before we sort of close for the day. One is some of the latest features. So yesterday there was a session with Greenway. Greenway is one of the EHRs that has adopted HealthLake. Greenway has thousands of customers, and as part of getting them onboarded, we've invested a decent amount of time in building this multi-tenancy, where if you have thousands of tenants, you can do so in a manner that's scalable without having to create a single data store for each of the tenant. At which point, even though it's a managed service, there's still some overhead associated with managing that all, right? So that's one there. On the FHIR profiles, I talked about implementation guides, right? Some customers are very permissive in terms of what they bring into HealthLake. Permissive in the sense that my customer or my stakeholder is giving me data. It has patient data. It is of value to me. I don't want to reject any part of that data, right? Is the posture that they have. And then some are, no, I have strict controls in terms of data quality. I'm going to only ingest something that I am ready to accept, right, based on my specific sort of data quality standards. So, but we don't decide that for you. You decide, right? So we have full flexibility from essentially issue warnings to basically be very strict in terms of what brings on. Event management as well. Data is coming in. You want to be notified about events. Suppose you're watching for a discharge, right? You can basically do eventing and take the next best action, especially if you're into value-based care and managed care or at-risk care, right? Those type of events are material. We also have a growing community of open source, not open source, of solutions that are created and published as part of AWS samples that you can also leverage. One of the ones that I want to call out is that because some of our customers have data from multiple sources, mastering an identity becomes extremely important, right? So for instance, my lab report could be coming in from the doctor's office, but also from the lab, the diagnostic center itself. So now you have two duplicate reports about Mirza, and you're trying to first identify, is there a match, number one, and number two, should you discard one or subsume one or merge? There's some business logic that you're gonna decide on, and there's a sister service called Amazon Entity Resolution where there's a pattern that we have created whereby it's just like 2 or 3 clicks, and you can basically get that going, right? In the sense like data comes in from multiple sources, a match is made, then you put business logic on top of it to decide what you want to do about it, right? It's not an MDM by any means, but it is a way for you to start making sense of the data that is coming in, right? So that the point I'm trying to make here is that is a representative of solutions that is published on AWS samples. If you go to the product page, you'll see some of those samples associated with that. So that way, the runway for you to get going becomes smaller, right? It's not a tremendous amount of lead time associated with that. We also have had recent launches. When we first launched, we launched here in America. Subsequently, we launched in India. India has, as you all know, a tremendous amount of population, and they're also adopting FHIR as a standard, not only for care, but also for payments and authorization. So we launched in India because we wanted to make sure that we had a presence there, and we wanted to satiate that market as well. And then very recently, like past couple of months, we launched in London and also in Sydney, Australia, right? Because both of those regions are also FHIR-centric or are moving towards FHIR from a consumption perspective. So what's next? As we talk about the issue at hand, right? So the scaling to petabytes, and then also one of the key things that I want to sort of call out is that my assumption is that many of you are from the payer world, not from a provider world. But even if you're not from the payer world, both payers and providers have a compliance piece that you have to address, right? On the provider side, you have ONC. On the payer side, you have CMS regulations. What we're trying to do from a AWS perspective is essentially give you a compliant data store for regulation X. So for instance, CMS 0057 is coming. What we're planning to do is basically hand over to say, this is just like HIPAA eligibility. We're going to say, this is a CMS 0057 eligible, compliance eligible data store, right? Meaning, if you bring in data, you can be assured that you're satiating the requirements for provider access, patient access, payer-to-payer, prior auth, and so on and so forth, right? All the sort of the things that are covered in CMS 0057F. Similarly, with HTI-1, we're going to do the same thing on the provider side as well. So basically, compliance-ready data stores, whereby, and at that point, you can basically invoke a third party to certify that if you prefer. So that way, the runway to get onboarded is much smaller. Like the slide you were talking about in terms of the pilot all the way to production, perhaps that now becomes easier to say, test, pressure test, right? Just validate, pressure test, and then go live, right? So that runway becomes less than a month. Our goal ideally is to bring you on board within 7 days, but in many worlds that's not realistic. And then the analytics piece. So right now I had mentioned for the analytics that the schema is FHIR. What we're going to do in late 2025 is we are going to actually leave that up to you in terms of for you to define that schema. So we're not going to impose that on you. You have the option to sort of bring your own schema in that sense, right? From an analytical perspective, not on the FHIR transaction side. And then Comprehend Medical, especially with Health Scribe coming in, you will have additional sort of higher level NLP related actions as well. So before I close, Mani, any last words?
Yeah, I wanted to highlight the feature slide. It was beautiful to see the feedback loop working, right? We talk about our pain points, and then HealthLake takes it back, and then comes up with the fixes, and then the roadmap building, the latest features and the future features. So I would close by saying that both Evernorth and AWS I think are very similar companies in the sense that we continuously look for data-driven opportunities, and we look for simple solutions in complex problems. And we will continue to keep an eye on what HealthLake brings to us in the future.
There's been a great partnership with Cigna and Evernorth, right? I use that term synonymously. I know there's a difference, but
like I highlighted earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. But Mani brings up a good point, right? In the sense that your use cases, the customer, especially large customers, have a multitude of use cases, and some of them are very, very specific to that particular organization. And this is true with HealthLake, but it's also true for other services as well. We work backwards from the customer, right? So if you find something that perhaps is not optimal or missing, reach out to us, right? And we will absolutely sit down with you and discuss it and see if there's a alternate source solution or possibly a product feature request that comes out of it. So happy to sort of work with certainly you and your team.
Sure.
But before I close, I do want to remind you to go to your mobile app and fill out the survey. Hopefully you found this informative. Mani and I are going to be essentially on the side here. If you have any questions, we'll hang around for at least 15 or so minutes until they kick us out, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you, and I truly appreciate you attending.
Thank you, everyone.